Welcome to week 5 of our Homeschool a Bible curriculum for middle schoolers and high schoolers. There are about 1,000 of you so far who have been taking classes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so it's so exciting to have you staying with us from week to week. And we're so glad that you're with us. What we want to do this week, we want to look at the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And Dr. Ken is going to cover those 4 books of the Bible here in just a moment. But before he does, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you through your daily readings and the questions that accompany those daily readings. You'll have overlapping readings again because you'll have 7 days worth of readings from 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then I believe you have 6 days of readings, maybe 7, but I believe 6 for 1st and 2nd Kings. They're going to come up on the screen here in a second, and so let's start here. Day 1. You'd read 1 Samuel chapter 3, and you'll answer the question, how did Samuel, as a little boy, receive his first words from the Lord, and thus his call as a prophet, a priest, and a judge? On day 2, you'll read 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 through 9, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 10 through 22, and 1 Samuel 9, and 1 Samuel 10. I know, a lot of reading for today. But you'll answer these 3 questions. What did the people want Samuel to do? Why did Samuel not want to do it? Before agreeing to their demand, what did Samuel warn would happen if Israel was given a king? And how did it come about that Saul was anointed king by Samuel? Then on day 3, you'll read 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 through 15, and chapter 15, verses 1 through 23. Your question is, what was Saul's attitude towards God's commands? On day 4, you'll read 1 Samuel 16, verses 1 through 13, and answer the question, how did it come about that David was anointed king by Samuel? On day 5, you'll read 1 Samuel 18, verses 6 through 9, chapter 19 and verse 1, chapter 19 and verse 11, chapter 21 and verse 10, chapter 22 and verse 1, chapter 23 and verse 15, chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, and chapter 26, verses 1 and 2. And answer the question, how would you describe Saul's relationship to David? Then on day 6, you'll read 1 Samuel 31, verses 1 through 13, and 2 Samuel 1, verses 1 through 27, and 2 Samuel 5, verses 1 through 5, and you'll answer the question, what happened after the death of Saul? On day 7, you'll read 2 Samuel 11, verses 1 to 12, and then verse 23. You'll also read chapter 14, verses 21 to 15, or rather Samuel chapter 14, verse 21 to chapter 15, verse 12. And then you'll read chapter 18, verses 1 to 18. And you'll answer the question, what were David's various sins and what were the results of those sins? Also, how did Absalom almost succeed in taking over the throne? And then up on the screen here, you'll see your readings for 1st and 2nd Kings. And again, you'll remember that those readings overlap. So you'll read your 1st and 2nd Samuel readings on the same days that you read your 1st and 2nd Kings. And so the first 6 days of reading for 1st and 2nd Kings are the same days 1 through 6 of your 7 days of readings for 1st and 2nd Samuel. In day 1, you'll be reading 1 Kings chapters 3 and 8 and also chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. You'll answer the question, what do we learn about Solomon as a young ruler? What did Solomon pray for when he dedicated the newly built temple? And what do we learn about Solomon during the later years of his life? On day 2, you'll read 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 to 24. After the death of Solomon, how did his son Rehoboam act toward the people, and what was the result? On day 3, you'll read 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 to 33, and 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 to 34, and 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 to 19. What did the first Jeroboam do? Because there were 2 Jeroboams. There's Jeroboam in 1 Kings, and there's a Jeroboam in 2 Kings. So what did the first Jeroboam do, the one that you're reading about here in 1 Kings chapter 12? Also, who was Ahab? And what did Ahab and his wife Jezebel do that was evil in the sight of God? Then on day 4, read 2 Kings 21, verses 1 to 18, and 2 Kings 18, 1 through 6, and 2 Kings 22, 1 to 2, and 2 Kings 23, verses 1 to 25. What sort of evil things did Manasseh do? What sort of things did Hezekiah do that were good in God's sight? And what sort of things did Josiah do that were good in God's sight? On day 5, you'll read 1 Kings 18, verses 17 to 46, and 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 to 37. You'll answer 2 questions. The first is, how did God show through Elijah that he was the one true God and all of the other gods were false? The second question, what significant miracle did God perform through Elisha? Then on day 6, you'll read 2 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 25, verses 1 through 12, and you'll answer the questions, according to this chapter, why did God allow Assyria to take the northern kingdom of Israel into exile? And then secondly, when the army of Babylon conquered Jerusalem, which was the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah, what did they do with the people who survived the attack? And so those will be your readings for 1st and 2nd Kings, and also for 1st and 2nd Samuel, and again the days will overlap. And so for the next 6 and 7 days, you'll be reading those. And when you do, also be sure to take good notes. Take good notes when Dr. Ken is teaching, so that you'll be able to show those notes to your teacher there at home, so that you'll be able to show that you're paying attention. And of course also you'll want to take in the material as you're hearing it. And so again, just so glad to have you with us. And let's go into the history song, and then Dr. Ken will teach the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings.
Joshua the Jordan, the rivers crossed, the walls of Jericho tumbled down. Achan disobeys, then Ahaz lost. Repentance lets them take the town. Gibeonites lies cost them pain. The sun stood still in the southern campaign. The north was won and territories claimed. Joshua asks, who will you serve in the promised land? The book of Joshua. Judges, history cycles round. They all do right in their own eyes. Oppression and repentance, then a judge is found. When up to God they raise their cry. Othniel and Ehud, victories won. Deborah, Barak, and Gideon. Jephthah, don't forget Samson. Ruth was also during this time. The cycles of
almost a year leading up to the adoption of my two youngest daughters, Ella and Anna, we had to go to Los Angeles Children's Court every 2 or 3 months. This was part of what we had to do to adopt out of the Los Angeles County foster system. We had the same judge every time we went in. We never really thought anything about it until adoption day. On the final day, when Ella and Anna were adopted, what we now call birding day in our house, we went into the same courtroom with the same judge. Trudy and I raised our right hands and took our oaths, a promise to treat our two new daughters, ages 11 and almost 9 at that time, the same as we would our biological children. My new daughters also made the promise to be part of our family. It was a joyful moment, one of the most important in the life of our family. When everything was done, we were invited to go behind the bench with the judge and take some family pictures. We chatted for a couple of minutes, snapped some photos, and left the courtroom. Then we sent out pictures to everyone we knew. Then an interesting thing started happening. We began getting messages back from people saying, "Isn't that Judge James Hahn, the former mayor of Los Angeles?" We're like, "I don't know. We didn't even live here when he was mayor." We had been in court with him multiple times but had no idea who he was. We were in the presence of someone who is quite well known in Southern California politics. In fact, he was the only politician ever to have been elected to all 3 citywide offices. That is, city controller, city attorney, and mayor of Los Angeles. We were in the presence of someone who is very well known, and we didn't even know it. Our theme today is, who is the real king? We don't have a monarchy in the United States. We're all very into political equality. I mean, we fought a war to break away from kings and queens. Actually, I remember going to a worship service one time in London. The entire worship service was built around a worship song, "Make way," or "Make way for Christ the King." That worked in London because they have some sense in their history of what a king or queen is. But we don't have any sort of history like that. The closest we have is an important political leader like a governor, or the president of our country, or a mayor of a large city like Los Angeles. But can you imagine what it would be like to be in the presence of a truly powerful king and not even know that it's the real king? It would be far more incredible than our experience with the former mayor of Los Angeles. So what happens when there is a real king, but people don't even realize that it's the real king? Our question for today is, who is the real king? This is one of the most important questions in the books of Samuel and Kings, what we normally call 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, the books we're looking at today. Last week when we were together, we were talking about the books of Joshua and Judges. But the very last verse of the book of Judges says this: "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." But that's all going to change in Samuel and Kings. Now, if you want to remember the content of Samuel, it's actually pretty easy. You just have to remember the 3 most important characters in Samuel. Do you know who the most important characters in the books of Samuel are? Yes, Samuel, right? And Saul and David. So Samuel, the prophet, and the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. In 1 Samuel 8, when Samuel was an old man, the people come and demand to have a king over them. Let's read it. 1 Samuel 8, 4 through 9. "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, 'You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have.' But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do.'" Who is the real king? God is the real king, not a human king or a king from the surrounding nations. They were in the presence of the real king God, and they didn't even know it. God said to Samuel, "They have rejected me as their king." So Samuel warns them what the king's going to do. He'll force their children into the military to serve in the court. He'll take away their best fields and their vineyards. He'll tax them heavily, and they won't like it. But 1 Samuel 8:19-20 says, "But the people refused to listen to Samuel. 'No,' they said, 'we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles.' So God says, 'Okay,' and selects Saul to be their king. At the installation ceremony of Saul as king, Samuel said this, 1 Samuel 12:13-15. "Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you, as it was against your fathers." Who is the real king? God is the real king. Not even the human king that God chooses to serve as king is the real king. The one who serves as human king is supposed to serve under the kingship of God. But as our song says, Saul won't listen to anything. He's independent, he's willful and stubborn, and increasingly unwilling to submit to the kingship of God. So here's what God says to him through Samuel. 1 Samuel 13:13-14. "You acted foolishly," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So God rejects him for being king and secretly sends Samuel to anoint David to be the next king of Israel. Who is the real king? The real king is God. Not even King David, the one God called a man after God's own heart, is the real king. The good thing about David, in contrast to Saul, is that he knew it. He knew that he was supposed to serve under the kingship of God. Even despite his famous sins later in his life, he kept coming back and acknowledging that God is the real king. And God makes a covenant with David that we talked about a few weeks ago. God made 4 great covenants in the Old Testament: the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the New covenant. Here are a couple of verses from the middle of the Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David. I won't read the whole thing to you, just a couple of verses. 2 Samuel 7:11b-12. "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom." Can we just move into the New Testament for a moment? God had promised to establish David's house with an unconditional covenant. How does the New Testament start? The first book of the New Testament, Matthew, opens with these words. Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. The New Testament says over and over again that Jesus is the one who fully fulfilled the requirements of the Davidic line in himself. He is the ultimate king in the line of David. Okay, let's go back to Samuel and Kings. The high point of a king serving under the kingship of God and focusing the worship of Israel on God happens under the reign of David and in the early years of Solomon. That's the high point, and it centers on the building of the temple. David makes preparations for the building of a temple, even though God doesn't let him build it. He pulls together a bunch of wood, stones, precious metals, fabrics, and more to prepare for the building of the temple. But Solomon, David's son, is the one who ends up building the temple. Who is the real king? God is the real king, not anyone or anything else. And the temple in Jerusalem is to be a permanent reminder that God is the real king. Now, Solomon shows a great start to his reign. He demonstrates a lot of wisdom and his reign prospers. Unfortunately, Solomon doesn't do what he's supposed to do. He becomes arrogant, he doesn't listen to what God says to do, and starts the bad cycle that goes all the way through the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Solomon does the things that Deuteronomy said he wasn't supposed to do. Let's go back to Deuteronomy for a moment and see what the king is not supposed to do. This is interesting. We're going back to Deuteronomy, and there's no king yet. But in one of Moses' final sermons before his death, he anticipates that there was coming a day when they would insist on having a king. So here's what he writes about it ahead of time. Now think about these verses in light of Solomon and what he's famous for. Deuteronomy 17, verses 16 and 17. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. 3 things: horses, wealth, and wives. Now, apart from his wisdom, what was Solomon famous for? 3 things. First of all, horses. 1 Kings 4:26. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. And 1 Kings 10:26. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. By the way, what's the problem with horses, especially for those of you who really like horses? The problem is that too many horses would cause you to rely upon your own military might instead of on the Lord. The second thing is wealth. There's a long section in 1 Kings 10 about this one, but here's just one verse. 1 Kings 10:27. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. And the third thing is wives. 1 Kings 11, 1-4. This is the saddest section about Solomon in the whole Bible. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. By the way, I once heard about an elementary school assignment where students were asked to write comments about the Bible. One kid wrote, Solomon had 700 wives and 300 porcupines. Solomon was famous for the very 3 things that God had explicitly said a king should not accumulate. Solomon forgot who the real king was. Now, you can just follow the words of our song for the rest of the story. There are some good moments, but most of it is a slide toward being exiled from the land of Israel. 10 tribes from Rehoboam slip away. Israel's Jeroboams, Ahab, and sons tend to lead the people astray. In Judah are the evil, like Manasseh, the good, Hezekiah and Josiah. God sends Elijah and Elisha. The end result of all this sin is exile from the land. Now, after Solomon, the nation split into 2 nations, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The rest of the book of Kings is about king after king who either thought of himself as the king or the few who knew that they served under the regency of the true king, God. But in general, they forgot who the real king was. There were evil kings like Jeroboam the first, Jeroboam the second, Ahab and Manasseh, who served the gods of the surrounding nations. In the southern kingdom were occasionally good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who understood that God was the real king. And along the way, God sent prophets like Elijah and Elisha to warn them to come back to the one true God and submit to his rule. Partway through the book of Kings, the northern kingdom of Israel is attacked and taken into exile by the nation of Assyria. At the very end of Kings, after hundreds of years of cycling downward, then the southern kingdom of Judah is attacked by the Babylonians and taken into exile. The end result of all their sin is exile from the land. One way of describing it is that they forgot who the real king was. Who is the real king? God is the real king. All right, let's bring this into the 21st century for a moment. There are lots of situations in which it's important to remember who the real king is. I was thinking of some scenarios this week. Imagine someone working in a company who is desperately trying to move up into ever higher positions of leadership. He so intensely wants the power and the prestige that comes with the positions above him that he forgets who the real king is. If only he would remember who the real king is, it would help him toward humility. Of course, he might accept a promotion if offered, but he wouldn't be desperate if he didn't get it. But the grasping for power is forgetting who the real king is. Or imagine that you work at a government office somewhere, like the Department of Motor Vehicles. People are dependent upon you to approve things for them or help them in some way. You have all the power and you know it. If you don't like the way someone looks, you can keep it from happening if you want to. Not too long ago, I was in this sort of situation and knew that I needed the person on the other side of the counter to take mercy on me. If you're ever in a situation like this, don't forget who the real king is. It's not you. If you remember who the real king is, you'll serve others with humility, with grace, with patience, and with care. Or here's one closer to home for me. Imagine that you're a teacher and that you have the authority to pass or fail someone on an exam, a paper, or an entire class. Doesn't remembering that God is the real king, not you, make a difference? Now, what did Jesus do when his disciples were jostling for positions of power in his coming kingdom? Mark 10:42-45. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Those who remember who the real king is will live with humility and grace and an attitude of service toward others. Now, as we do at the end of each session, let's bow our heads and pray a prayer drawn in large part from the prayer of Hannah, the mother of Samuel, found right at the beginning of this section of the Bible. That's 1 Samuel 2. Pray aloud after me. Sovereign God, you are the real king. There is no king besides you. You set up the kings on their thrones and depose them as you will. You close arrogant mouths and raise up the humble of heart. You shatter the bows of the mighty and clothe the weak with strength. Those who contend with you, Lord, against them you will thunder in the heavens. You will judge the ends of the earth in righteousness and holiness, for you are King. There is no other king. We bow in reverence before you. In the name of Messiah Jesus, the Son of David, whom you have declared King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Amen.